the vanishing lake. James was an experienced solo hiker, someone who sought out the most remote trails for the peace and solitude they provided. His latest adventure was Clearwater Lake, a hidden gem deep within the Rockies, known only to a few locals. The lake had no marked trails leading to it and existed primarily in whispers shared by avid outdoors enthusiasts. The descriptions were tantalizing. A pristine lake surrounded by jagged peaks, its surface so reflective that it was often mistaken for a second sky. Using scraps of information he had gathered from forums and local stories, James pieced together a rough map. It would be a challenging trek through uncharted territory, but the allure of discovering Clearwater Lake was too tempting to resist. The journey began early, under the warm hues of dawn. The trailhead was unmarked, just a faint indentation in the grass where others may have walked before. James felt a thrill of excitement as he followed the path, passing through dense pine forests and climbing rocky inclines. The higher he climbed, the thinner the air became, and the more isolated he felt. Around mid-afternoon, after hours of grueling hiking, James reached a ridge that overlooked a hidden valley. There it was, Clearwater Lake. It was more beautiful than he had imagined. The water was a perfect mirror, its surface undisturbed and reflecting the surrounding peaks with surreal clarity. The air around the lake was eerily still, as if time itself had paused in this secluded place. James stood on the ridge for a long moment, taking it all in before descending into the valley. He found a flat area near the shore to set up camp. The ground was soft and covered in moss, and the lake's edge shimmered with an almost otherworldly light. As he unpacked his gear, James noticed the uncanny silence. No birds chirped, no insects buzzed, and there was no wind to ripple the water. The stillness was absolute. James shrugged off the oddness, chalking it up to the lake's remote location. He spent the rest of the day exploring the shoreline and marveling at the scenery. By nightfall, he was exhausted but content. He lit a small fire, made himself dinner, and sat watching the stars reflected in the lake. It felt like he was on another planet, cut off from the rest of the world. As sleep overtook him, James crawled into his tent, lulled by the warmth of the fire outside. James woke abruptly in the middle of the night. The fire had gone out, leaving his campsite in complete darkness. The air was freezing, much colder than it had been earlier. Groggy and disoriented, James unzipped his tent and stepped outside. What he saw made his stomach drop. The lake was gone. In its place was a barren crater, the earth dry and cracked as if no water had ever been there. The reflective surface, the pristine beauty, it had all vanished. James stumbled closer, shining his flashlight on the ground. There was no mud, no damp soil, nothing to suggest the lake had existed just hours ago. As he stood there, trying to process what he was seeing, a low, vibrating hum filled the air. It was faint at first, but it grew steadily louder. James turned, sweeping his flashlight across the surrounding valley. The beam caught movement. Figures were emerging from the shadows of the forest. They were tall and unnaturally thin, their skin pale and almost translucent. Their movements were smooth, too smooth, as though they were gliding rather than walking. Their eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the beam of James's flashlight like those of nocturnal animals. Panic surged through him. He stumbled back toward his campsite, fumbling for his gear. The figures moved closer, their glowing eyes locked on him. The hum grew deafening, vibrating in his chest and making it hard to think. James grabbed his pack, abandoning his tent in his haste to escape. He ran blindly through the darkness, the beam of his flashlight bouncing wildly with each step. The forest closed in around him, the trees becoming a blur as he stumbled over roots and rocks. The hum followed him, seeming to come from everywhere at once. He glanced back and saw the figures still following, their movements unhurried but relentless. James's lungs burned as he pushed himself harder, his survival instincts kicking in. After what felt like hours, he tripped over an exposed root and fell hard to the ground. The flashlight flew from his hand, its beam illuminating the towering trees above. James scrambled to his feet, but the hum had stopped. The forest was silent again. Terrified, James stood frozen, his eyes darting around for any sign of the figures. But there was nothing. No movement, no sound, just the oppressive silence of the woods. He retrieved his flashlight and forced himself to keep walking, too afraid to stop. Eventually, the forest began to thin, and James saw the faint outline of the trailhead in the early morning light. Relief flooded through him as he stumbled onto the gravel parking lot where his car was parked. He leaned against the car, catching his breath and trying to make sense of what had happened. As he looked back toward the forest, he thought he saw movement, just a flicker of something pale disappearing into the trees. James didn't wait to investigate. He climbed into his car, started the engine, and drove away as fast as he could. Days later, James tried to find information about Clearwater Lake. He searched forums, maps, and even contacted locals in the area. No one seemed to know what he was talking about. One older man, however, responded to James's description with a cryptic warning. Clearwater isn't on any map for a reason. Some places aren't meant to. The Forgotten Ascent. Clara had always loved the challenge of solo hiking. To her, the isolation was a sanctuary from the noise of city life. For her latest adventure, she chose Cedar Ridge, a lesser-known trail in the Appalachian Mountains. Its remoteness promised peace, and its peak, Cedar Summit, offered breathtaking views. She had read accounts of hikers venturing up the trail but noted that none seemed to describe the peak. Most stories ended with vague descriptions of turning back midway, citing either fatigue or the sudden change in weather. That only intrigued Clara further. She wanted to see what lay at the top. The trail began as expected, serene and beautiful. The air smelled of pine, and the occasional rustle of leaves reminded her how alive the forest was. Clara felt at peace, moving with the rhythm of the trail as it wound higher into the mountains. By late afternoon, she reached a fork in the trail that wasn't marked on her map. One path was well-trodden, continuing upward, while the other was overgrown, almost hidden by dense foliage. Clara hesitated but then decided to take the overgrown trail, assuming it was an older path no longer maintained. The forest around her grew darker as she ascended. The trees seemed closer together, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. The air grew cooler, and an uneasy silence replaced the usual forest sounds. Hours passed, and the trail showed no sign of ending. Clara's legs ached, and the weight of her backpack seemed heavier with every step. Just as she considered turning back, the trees thinned, and she emerged into a clearing. There it was, Cedar Summit. But it wasn't what she expected. The peak was devoid of the vibrant colors she had seen in photos of nearby summits. The ground was covered in a gray, ashy substance, and the sparse trees were blackened and lifeless. In the center of the summit stood an old wooden cabin. Its roof caved in and its windows shattered. Clara's excitement gave way to unease. The cabin looked abandoned, yet she felt as if someone, or something, was watching her. Against her better judgment, she approached it, the crunch of ash beneath her boots breaking the eerie silence. Inside, the cabin was barren except for a single chair placed in the middle of the room. The walls were covered in strange, angular symbols etched into the wood, their patterns chaotic and unsettling. Clara took a photo, thinking she could look them up later, but her phone screen glitched and froze every time she tried. A sudden gust of wind slammed the door shut behind her. Clara spun around, her heart racing. The room was cold, far colder than it should have been for the season. She grabbed her flashlight and shone it around the room, half expecting to see someone. Instead, she saw a figure in the far corner. It was barely visible, more shadow than substance, but its outline was unmistakable. A tall, thin shape with unnaturally long limbs. Clara stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the chair. The figure didn't move, but its presence filled the room with an oppressive weight. Summoning her courage, Clara bolted for the door, throwing it open and running out into the clearing. She didn't stop to catch her breath until she was halfway down the trail. The descent was a nightmare. The trail seemed different, as though it had shifted while she was at the summit. What had been straightforward paths now twisted and forked unpredictably. forcing her to choose directions at random. Worse, the shadowy figure was following her. She saw it whenever she glanced over her shoulder, its shape blending with the trees but never too far behind. Panic set in as the sky darkened. Clara checked her watch. It was only 4 p.m., but the forest was as dark as night. Her flashlight barely cut through the gloom, and the noises around her had changed. There were no rustling leaves or distant bird calls, just a faint whispering that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Finally, after what felt like hours, Clara stumbled onto the well-trodden trail from earlier. Relief flooded her as she recognized landmarks she had passed that morning. She picked up her pace, her legs burning with exertion, and didn't stop until she reached the parking lot where her car was parked. When she looked back toward the trail, she saw it again. The figure stood at the tree line, its head tilted as if watching her. Clara didn't wait to see what it would do. She jumped into her car and sped away, not stopping until she reached her home hours later. Over the next few days, Clara tried to research Cedar Ridge and its summit. To her surprise, there was almost no information available. Even the forums where she had originally read about the trail seemed to have removed any mention of it. The symbols she had seen in the cabin stayed with her, though haunting her thoughts. She sketched them as best she could and shared them with an online group specializing in ancient languages and cryptic symbols. One member responded, "These aren't symbols, they're warnings. Whoever carved them wanted people to stay away." The message was enough to keep Clara from ever hiking alone again. The summit, the shadowy figure, and the inexplicable changes in the trail had shaken her confidence. She now warns other hikers to trust their instincts and, above all, to turn back when something doesn't feel right. Some places, Clara realized too late, were meant to stay forgotten. The echoes of Black Hollow. Ethan was an amateur photographer and an avid hiker. His weekends were often spent in the backcountry, searching for untouched scenery to capture with his camera. One weekend, a fellow hiker mentioned Black Hollow, an unmarked trail deep in the Smoky Mountains. It was said to be hauntingly beautiful, with its dense fog, towering trees, and a creek that carved its way through the valley. The description was enough to entice Ethan. He packed his gear, drove to the area, and found the faint trailhead, marked only by a weathered wooden post with no sign or marker. The path was overgrown, but Ethan's adventurous spirit urged him forward. The trail lived up to its reputation. The forest was thick, the air heavy with the smell of damp earth. A mist lingered, even as the sun climbed higher. It felt otherworldly, as if he had stepped into a place untouched by time. After a few hours, Ethan came across the creek. It wound through the hollow like a silver ribbon, its surface reflecting the overcast sky. He followed it deeper into the valley, taking photos of the gnarled trees and moss-covered rocks. The deeper he went, the stranger the atmosphere became. The air grew colder, and an unsettling quiet settled over the forest. There were no bird calls or rustling leaves, only the sound of his own footsteps and the faint trickle of the creek. As he rounded a bend, he saw something that made him stop. A dilapidated cabin sat on the edge of the creek, its roof caved in and its walls leaning precariously. Ethan hadn't expected to see any signs of human habitation this far out. Intrigued, he approached cautiously, his camera at the ready. The cabin's door hung ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. Inside, the floor was covered in leaves and debris. An old rocking chair sat in one corner, its wood warped and splintered. But what caught Ethan's eye was the writing on the walls. Words and symbols had been scratched into the wood, overlapping and chaotic. Some were in English, phrases like, "Do not listen," and "They are near." Others were in languages Ethan didn't recognize, their jagged characters unsettling. As he examined the markings, a sound broke the silence. It was faint at first, like distant whispers carried on the wind. Ethan froze, straining to listen. The whispers grew louder, filling the small cabin. They were indistinct, overlapping voices that seemed to come from every direction. Ethan's breath quickened. He stepped outside, hoping the open air would calm him. But the whispers followed. He turned toward the creek and saw ripples forming in the water, though there was no breeze to disturb it. The ripples grew into waves, and then the water stilled completely. Ethan's reflection stared back at him, but it wasn't his reflection. The face in the water was older, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare through him. Ethan stumbled back, his heart pounding. The whispers became louder, almost a chant. Shadows moved at the edges of his vision, darting between the trees. Panic set in as Ethan realized he wasn't alone. He grabbed his gear and ran, his boots slipping on the damp ground. The shadows followed, flickering like smoke through the trees. Ethan didn't dare look back. The chanting grew deafening, a cacophony of voices that drowned out his thoughts. The trail twisted and turned, and Ethan struggled to find his way. He tripped over roots and slid down muddy slopes, his camera banging against his side. The forest seemed endless, the mist thicker than ever. Finally, he saw a break in the trees, the trailhead. Relief flooded him as he burst out of the forest and into the clearing where his car was parked. But the whispers didn't stop. Even as he drove away, he could hear them faintly in the back of his mind. His ears rang, and his vision blurred as if the forest had left its mark on him. Over the following days, Ethan tried to piece together what had happened. He developed the photos he had taken, hoping they would offer some clue. Most were normal pictures of trees, the creek, the cabin, but one photo sent chills down his spine. It was a shot of the cabin's interior, focused on the writing on the walls. In the corner of the frame, barely visible, was a shadowy figure standing in the doorway. Its form was indistinct, but its presence was unmistakable. Ethan deleted the photo immediately, but he couldn't erase the memory. He tried to share his experience online, but his posts would vanish, and others who knew of Black Hollow refused to discuss it. One hiker messaged him privately, "You're lucky you made it out. Most don't." The message included a final warning, "Whatever followed you, don't let it in." Ethan hasn't returned to Black Hollow or any remote trail since. At night, he still hears the whispers, faint but persistent, as if the forest is calling him back. The vanishing path. Mia had always prided herself on her ability to navigate even the most challenging trails. Equipped with a GPS, a compass, and an innate sense of direction, she felt unstoppable. So, when she heard about the infamous vanishing path in the Colorado Rockies, she couldn't resist the challenge. The vanishing path wasn't on any official map, and its name came from the countless stories of hikers losing their way. Some never returned, while others came back unable to explain what had happened. Mia dismissed the tales as exaggerations, certain she could handle it. She started early in the morning, her boots crunching against the frost-kissed ground. The trail was faint but visible, winding its way through dense pine forests and rocky outcrops. The first few hours were uneventful, and Mia's confidence grew with each step. By midday, she reached a small clearing where she stopped to eat. The view was breathtaking, rolling hills framed by snow-capped peaks. She noticed something peculiar, though the forest was eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of her own breathing. Pushing the unease aside, Mia continued. The trail became harder to follow as the underbrush thickened. She relied on her GPS, but the device began glitching, the screen flickering erratically. She switched to her compass, but it spun aimlessly, as if confused. Panic crept in as Mia realized she was truly lost. The trail seemed to dissolve into the forest, leaving her surrounded by identical trees. She retraced her steps, only to find herself back at the clearing she had stopped at earlier. Except now it was different. The trees surrounding the clearing seemed taller, their branches twisted unnaturally. The air was heavy, and a faint hum vibrated through the ground. Mia's heart raced as she looked for landmarks, but everything was unfamiliar. A shadow moved at the edge of the clearing. Mia froze, her eyes scanning the forest. The shadow was fleeting, almost too quick to notice, but it left an imprint on her mind. A tall, humanoid shape that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. She decided to head in the opposite direction, leaving the clearing behind. As she walked, the forest seemed to close in around her. The trees grew closer together, their gnarled roots reaching across the path like skeletal hands. Hours passed, and the sun began to set, casting long shadows that danced ominously. Mia's flashlight flickered as if the batteries were dying, though she had just replaced them. She pressed on, her breathing ragged, her muscles aching. Then, she saw it. A cabin in the distance, its roof partially collapsed, smoke curling from a crooked chimney. Relief washed over her. Someone was there, she thought. She wasn't alone. Mia approached cautiously, knocking on the warped wooden door. It creaked open on its own, revealing a single room lit by a dim, flickering lantern. The cabin was empty, but the table was set with a single plate of food, a piece of bread and a steaming bowl of soup. Her stomach growled, but something about the setup felt wrong. She called out, her voice trembling, but no one answered. Instead, she heard the faint hum again, louder this time, coming from the forest behind her. She turned to see the shadowy figure standing at the tree line. It was clearer now. A tall, emaciated being with elongated limbs and empty, black eyes. It didn't move but seemed to pulsate with the hum, its form shifting like smoke. Mia slammed the door shut and backed away, her heart pounding. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the cabin. Suddenly, the door burst open, but nothing entered. Grabbing her pack, Mia bolted from the cabin, running blindly into the forest. The hum followed her, growing louder, its rhythm erratic and maddening. She stumbled over roots and rocks, her flashlight now useless. She ran until her legs gave out, collapsing at the base of a massive tree. The hum was gone, replaced by an oppressive silence. Mia dared to look around, but the forest was pitch black. Then she noticed something chilling. She was back at the clearing. The cabin was there, its lantern flickering in the window. The bread and soup were gone, replaced by her own GPS and compass, neatly arranged on the table. She didn't stay to question it. Summoning the last of her strength, Mia fled into the night. When she finally stumbled out of the forest at dawn, she found herself miles from her starting point, her clothes torn and her body covered in scratches. A group of campers found her and called for help. Mia later learned that the vanishing path was closed to hikers due to its reputation for inexplicable phenomena. Locals whispered about a curse, but no one could explain the disappearances or the strange occurrences. Her GPS and compass were never found, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, had been watching her the entire time. Mia hasn't hiked since, her once unshakable confidence replaced by a lingering fear of the unknown. The Silent Summit. Greg was an experienced hiker and mountaineer who thrived on solo treks. His friends often joked that he was addicted to the solitude of the wilderness, but for Greg, the isolation was part of the allure. When he heard about Gray Peak, a remote mountain in the Cascades with a reputation for its haunting beauty, he decided it would be his next adventure. Locals warned him about the trail. Gray Peak changes people, an elderly man at a gas station had said cryptically. Greg laughed it off, chalking it up to local legends designed to spook outsiders. The trail to Gray Peak started innocuously enough, winding through lush forests and across crystal-clear streams. Greg felt a rush of excitement as he ascended, his camera snapping photos of the breathtaking views. But as he climbed higher, the forest began to thin, replaced by jagged rocks and sparse vegetation. A dense fog rolled in, obscuring the trail and muting the sounds of the forest. Greg's footsteps seemed unnaturally loud against the silence. By late afternoon, he reached the base of the summit. The fog was so thick now that he could barely see a few feet ahead. He decided to make camp and attempt the summit in the morning. As he set up his tent, Greg noticed something odd. The silence wasn't just an absence of sound. It was oppressive, almost tangible. Even his breathing felt muted. He dismissed it as his imagination, exhaustion playing tricks on him. That night, he woke to a sound, a faint, rhythmic tapping. He unzipped his tent and peered outside, his headlamp cutting through the fog. The tapping stopped. The landscape was empty, the rocks and twisted shrubs motionless in the dim light. Then he saw them, footprints in the dirt, leading away from his tent. They were fresh, the edges sharp, but they didn't make sense. The prints were bare, human-like, but with clawed toes that dug deep into the soil. Greg's skin prickled. He called out into the void, but his voice was swallowed by the fog. The silence returned, heavier than before. The next morning, Greg packed up quickly, shaken but determined to finish the climb. The summit wasn't far, and he didn't want to leave without reaching it. The trail was barely discernible now, the fog clinging to him like a shroud. As he climbed, he felt an odd sensation, as if the mountain itself were watching him. Halfway to the summit, he encountered something that made him freeze. A cairn of rocks stood in the middle of the trail, perfectly balanced and unnatural in its symmetry. It hadn't been there the day before. On top of the cairn was a single feather, black and glossy, glinting even in the dull light. Greg's instincts screamed at him to turn back, but he pushed on, unwilling to let fear dictate his actions. When he finally reached the summit, the view was nothing like he had hoped. The fog was impenetrable, the world beyond the edge of the cliff completely obscured. The silence was suffocating. Then he heard it, a low, guttural growl. Greg spun around, his heart pounding. Standing a few feet away was a figure shrouded in mist. It was tall, impossibly so, with elongated limbs that seemed to stretch and contract with the shifting fog. Its face was featureless, but its presence radiated malice. The figure stepped closer, and the growl deepened, vibrating through Greg's chest. He stumbled backward, nearly toppling over the edge of the cliff. Gripping the ground for balance, Greg grabbed a rock and hurled it at the creature. It passed through the figure as if it weren't solid, and the growl turned into a deafening roar. In a blind panic, Greg ran. The trail down was a blur, his feet slipping on loose rocks and uneven ground. The fog seemed alive, wrapping around him, pulling him back. The growls followed, growing louder, closer. When Greg finally burst out of the foggy zone and back into the forest, the sound stopped. The silence lifted, replaced by the chirping of birds and the rustle of leaves. He didn't stop running until he reached his car. Back in town, Greg shared his story, but the locals only gave him knowing looks. "You're lucky," one man said. "Most don't come back from Gray Peak." Greg's camera was his only witness, but when he developed the photos, they were all blank except for one. It was a shot of the summit, shrouded in fog, with a dark figure barely visible in the background. Greg hasn't been able to explain what he encountered on Gray Peak, but he's never returned to the mountain since. The memory of the silent summit lingers, a reminder of the thin line between solitude and something far darker.